Welcome to the Homestead Farm Podcast. We're learning about folk tinctures today with Suzanne Shires, a master herbalist. I hope you guys enjoy the show. Stay tuned for further.
Hello and welcome to the Homestead Farm Podcast, your southern hub for all things homesteading. I'm your host, Emily Faulkner. Come grow with us today as we learn about herbal medicine on the homestead. This podcast episode is the first in an herbal medicine series. Today we're excited to have Suzanne Shires with us, a master herbalist who will share valuable tips and tricks to make your herbal remedies more potent and effective. She'll guide us on combining herbs and folk remedies and best practices for making tinctures at home. Some background on our special guest, Suzanne, a North Carolina native, homesteader, author, and master herbalist, calls the Blue Ridge Mountains home. Raised in a large family with extensive gardens, she learned natural food preservation from a young age, starting canning at age 7 with her mother, and sustainability from her mountain folk grandparents. Suzanne grew up with Appalachian mountain remedies and developed a deep interest in herbalism and whole food nutrition. Her education included foraging edible plants and medicines, fermenting, winemaking, creating homemade vinegars, seasonings, and herbal remedies. Welcome to the podcast, Suzanne.
Thank you very much. Fun to be here.
And I also just wanted to put out a disclaimer that the information shared in this podcast is for educational purposes. It should not be taken as personal, medical, or legal advice. So without further ado, we'll get into the topic. As some home herbalists, we often question whether our folk remedies will truly keep our families healthy. Suzanne can help. She will share simple tricks and tips to make your herbal remedies more potent and effective, helping to keep us balanced and healthy. She'll discuss combining herbs for effective remedies and best practices for making tinctures at home. So Suzanne, you can have the floor, whatever you want to talk about.
All right. I talk about making tinctures quite often, and the first thing that people will say is, how long does it sit, or what kind of alcohol do I use? Those are great questions. When you're looking at making a tincture of your own, but one, you're going to look at the part of the plant. If you're using leaf, flower, soft material, stems, I use stems a lot, especially the meristematic part, which is called the tasty bits, the very pliable, something that you could actually chew and swallow. Those parts of the plant that are tender are going to have medicine in them. So now a hard woody stem is not meristematic. And I'm not talking about eating these plants. I'm just using that as an example. But if it's a tender part of the plant and your goal is to use leaves and flowers, I'll go ahead and use the stems because stems will have some medicine in them. But at that point, when I figure out what part of the plant that I'm going to take, then you can talk about your alcohol.
Newbies to folk medicine, what is a tincture?
Tincture, that's a good question. I should have started with that. A tincture is an alcohol-based extraction. If you're going to use water for an extraction, that's typically considered a tea or an infusion, but alcohol will extract certain constituents in your plants that water may or may not extract. Certain things like, for example, if you've ever used a grape leaf in pickles to make your pickles crisper, you're extracting constituents out of that grape leaf that you wouldn't get with another herb. The same thing goes for tea. If you're making tea and your tea gets nice and colorful, or it gets dark, or some herbs won't even make it dark and just still be a light tea, you're extracting and using the solvent of water. Now, solvent is a scary word for a lot of people, but just means something that's going to extract those chemicals and those constituents. Now, that's a little bit of science involved in folk tincturing, but don't let it scare you. It's just basic chemistry. We're going to extract something out of the plant using a solvent, and in this case, we're going to talk about the alcohol that we'll use. If you're going to do an 80 proof alcohol to make a tincture, and you'll stuff a folk tincture is where you just put your herb in a jar, and then you put your alcohol on top of it. Most people will use 80 proof. 80 proof is fine for some herbs, especially the ones I just happen to have one right here. This is a motherwort plant. This part up here, see how pliable that is? I would use this plant down to about here, chop it up, put it in my jar, and use alcohol. If I'm going to use 80 proof, that would be okay, but just be aware that 80 proof means 40% alcohol. You're going to have more water than alcohol. And the biggest question I get is, what kind of alcohol should I use? Typically, we'll use no less than 100 proof, which means 50% water and 50% alcohol. Alcohol is going to extract certain constituents, and water will extract certain constituents. So when you set that jar on your shelf, you're pulling out things from both of those solvents. Now, there's that word, but you're pulling out both of constituents. It may be tannins, it may be flavonoids. Those things aren't really as important as knowing how much you're extracting in total. It doesn't matter as much what you're extracting. It's just the fact that when you're starting out, it's just the fact that you are extracting. So you may want to use 100 proof to get equal amounts of water and alcohol. Does that sound confusing?
No, I think that's well, maybe if someone was just starting out, but me as a nurse practitioner, I understand those terms just perfectly. I was going to ask you though, because I've heard of the rule when talking about referencing homemade vinegars, fill it twice. So you take your jar, fill it full, packed to the brim with your herb, and then fill it again with your alcohol or your whatever you're going to use to extract.
Right.
To solve it.
That's a good method. A more precise method is a ratio. But if you're going to just pack herb into your jar and fill it full, a folk tincture is where you just pack it and then fill up the empty space with the liquid. Perfectly fine. The problem with it is you don't know the dosage. You wouldn't be able to get. You wouldn't be able to know how much. And I use this word lightly, medicine. We're not supposed to talk about medicine with herbalism, as you know, but that's just an FDA rule. But what we're pulling out is the things that are beneficial. If you're pulling out, if you have your folk tincture, you don't know how much of that good stuff you're pulling out, so you may have to adjust your dose. If you're doing a ratio, you know a little bit more about how to dose that, how much to take. Again, dose is a word we're not supposed to use, but it fits here. You know how much you're going to take daily. And remember, all tinctures, all herbs are designed by God to bring health, if you've got too much of this or too high that, you're trying to come back to a balance, so that you have a whole health approach. So if you're looking to, say, assist the body with lowering blood pressure, and you're using a certain herb for that, that's going to help your body work more efficiently to correct that blood pressure. You want to know how much of that to take. If you have a low blood pressure, you're trying to get it back to normal, you'll still want to know what that dosage is. And everybody is different. But when you have a ratio tincture, and I'll explain what that is in a minute, when you have a ratio tincture, you're able to know that dosage from one batch to the next batch. Whereas a folk tincture, you don't know how much herb you stuffed in that jar. And they work, but you just have to adjust that dosage. So one person who takes it might take much more than another person who would take less. Now, to talk about a ratio tincture, to make your tinctures a little bit more potent, to make them a little bit more uniform, you can weigh that herb out. If you're taking fresh motherwort that I just used, you'll take 1 ounce of fresh motherwort to about 2 ounces of 100 proof alcohol, and that proof means 2 times. Proof is twice the alcohol amount. 80 proof is 40% alcohol. 100 proof is 50% alcohol. 190 proof, or PGA, is 95% alcohol, which I kind of prefer because I have a more concise, a more precise tincture. but that's difficult for a lot of people to start with. 100 proof is fine.
So you said you typically prefer using PGA, pure grain alcohol, for your
I
tinctures?
do, and I'll put my water in
Now,
where
does that matter, the herb that you're tincturing? Because I did that with lemon balm, and then later I read, oh, it's a volatile herb. You shouldn't use PGA with lemon balm.
well, anytime there's a volatile herb, and that would be in the mint family, in the Lamiaceae family, if it has a fragrance, not all volatile oils have fragrance, but that's a good indicator that it does have a volatile oil. Volatile doesn't mean flammable, it means effective. When it has those volatile oils, I almost always use 190 proof. And then I'll add water back because most of those Lamiaceae have water-soluble constituents. And some of those chemicals that we're trying to pull out will pull out just fine in a lemon balm tea. If you want the alcohol part, the alcohol constituents, you'll want to use alcohol. If you use 100 proof, that's fine as well, but I feel like I get a more effective tincture by using 190 proof, and then I put my water tincture to it, my water infusion back to where I want it. It's a math. It's a little bit of math, and that scares people. I find that scares people the most, the fact that it's math. But if you just realize that you've got 1 part alcohol and 1 part water, and you want to blend those to where you come back to that equal amount, something that's fresh like lemon balm, you wouldn't use as much water. So that's a little confusing for people. So I just always say, when you're beginning, use your 100 proof, unless it's a resin. That would be a bark or a root, something like that, or sap coming from a pine tree. Just think of that sap from a pine tree as a resin. And that almost always takes 190 proof. But let's not talk about that. Let's talk about this kind. We'll talk about that in a minute. I don't want to confuse you. And it does tend to confuse people. But if you're using a fresh leafy herb, I would stick with 100 proof. Because it feels like you're just making more tea than alcohol if you're using 80 proof. I can add more water if I need to. So that's why I usually will use 190 proof. And I get a very potent, very effective tincture that way. But if we're going to use our 190 proof, if we're going to use our 100 proof, 50% water, 50% alcohol, you'll use 1 ounce of herb to 2 ounces of that 100 proof alcohol. Now, the best way to do that is to grind that herb so that you have more surface area. And I used this analogy one time of a whole head of cabbage versus a ground cabbage like slaw. You've got more, if that makes a silly analogy, but it works for a lot of people because it's silly and you remember it. If you got a whole head of cabbage, you have very little surface area versus ground up cabbage or chopped up cabbage that you would make as slaw. You can have more surface area. So when you grind that up, you'll have a more potent, you'll be able to extract better. So if you have your 2 ounces of alcohol, sometimes that won't even moisten the entire herb that you have. So when you grind it up, it does moisten it a little bit better. So you can use a blender, you can use a Ninja or a Bullet, or it doesn't have to be an expensive piece of equipment. Just use your blender if you need to. And sometimes I will have to add a little bit more alcohol. The herb is absorbing all of that. You can use a little bit extra alcohol, about 1/4, to moisten your material, even if it's fresh material. Now, if it's dry, the ratio, instead of 1:2, is going to be 1:5. So you would have 1 ounce of dried lemon balm to 5 ounces of 100 proof alcohol. And then you would add back 1 ounce, about 1 ounce, to that dry herb to moisten it, and just wet it and let that sit for a little bit to soak it up. Because if you just add your 5 ounces on top of dry herb, it's going to soak it all up, and it'll be hard to stir it or hard to shake it. There won't be enough alcohol.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So you're just going to add back about 1/4 of the alcohol that you're using. So if you have 5 ounces, just go ahead and round that up to 6, almost 7 ounces of alcohol. And so that would be about half a pint. So if you're getting the small bottle of alcohol at most alcohol beverage stores, you can use a pint, or if you're going to go ahead and get the fifth or the half gallon, just measure it out and use about 7 ounces to your 1 ounce of herb, and put that in your jar. Grind up your herb if you can. If you're buying herb, you want to buy them whole as possible, and that's usually called cut and sifted. The more whole it is, the more the more potent it's going to be. If it's ground up really fine and you buy it powdered or fine, it's going to be less effective. So buy it as whole as possible. If you buy powdered herb, that's fine too. You can still use it. But you have your 1 ounce, wet it with a little bit of the alcohol and let it sit in your jar for a few minutes to an hour, even overnight, and then pour in the rest of your alcohol. And I do that with moist fresh herb as well, just to get the alcohol into the plant and let it absorb that alcohol, and then I'll pour the rest of my alcohol in. It's just a little tip I do.
Can I ask you a question when you're talking about grinding up the herbs? Now, I've heard this from a friend of mine. She's actually a master gardener, but she makes vinegar. She's not a master herbalist, but I just was curious. She mentioned that when you cut an herb with something metal, or I guess, for instance, if it was in a blender, that there's a chemical reaction that can occur that makes it turn brown. That's not good for, I guess, whatever you're trying to extract. Is that true? Or should you not worry about using those kind of things?
There are certain herbs that don't react well with the metal, so it would be better to use a wooden spoon, but I don't know any wooden knives. If you're going to chop it up on a cutting board, you're going to have to use that. Something like red clover, if you're touching it with your hand, you're going to turn it brown anyway. If you're drying it, it's going to turn brown, it's going to oxidize. That doesn't necessarily affect the chemicals in it, just doesn't make it pretty. Now, when you're to relieve that, you can make sure you wash your hands before you start gathering that red clover, which is very good for women, by the way. But you want to take 2 fingers and just pop those buds off under that top layer, or that top leaf that's right under the bud. Just pop it off. And then when you put them on screens or put them in your dehydrator, I usually will use window screens. Just lay them out and handle them as little as possible. And then I'll take and pat when I want to stir them up to make sure they dry evenly. I'll just pat underneath the screen instead of taking and ruffling them up with my hands, because when you touch them, the oils in your hands are going to oxidize it too. All things equal, you're going to have something to ground it or chop it with. And if it's a stainless steel knife or a stainless steel blade, I feel like it would be better than, say, if you have a plastic, something that would be great. That's going to have less oxidation, but I would prefer that as to use aluminum or something like that. So
I guess as long as it wouldn't affect the chemical, effect, like the medicinal qualities of the herb, I feel like it wouldn't. You're just making it hard on yourself.
Yeah.
I just thought that, if it affected it somehow. Yay, we're back. Sorry, having some technical difficulties. Okay, so I'm going to ask you, because this kind of goes along with what you were talking about, Suzanne, when you were discussing, doing the tinctures. Is it true that some herbs work synergistically, meaning you need smaller amounts when they're combined for a better effect?
I believe so. I feel that certain herbs you won't need quite as much, or they'll only need to be a portion of your formula. Now, I wouldn't make the tincture any less potent. I would still use the same amount so that you have a uniform tincture. But when you're making a formulary, and you're using one main herb, let's say you're going to make a cold formula. If you have your main ingredients, your main tincture is going to be for congestion. You could certainly add something for sniffles. You could certainly add something for headache or body aches. These are your corollaries. Additional herbs that, and I would tincture each one of those individually and add them, because one person may need more headache relief and another person may not have sniffles, very few sniffles at all. So you don't want to add quite as much for them. So when you are making a formulary, you can make your standard formulary with your standard strength tinctures, but just use less of each. And that way, instead of making all of that together, you have that individual sniffle formula tincture. Goldenrod, for example, wonderful for sniffles or for any type of sinus, but you would have a bottle of goldenrod tincture for allergies, as well as an antihistamine, but you could still add it into a cold formula as well. So make that individually at the regular strength, and then just figure out how much you want in that particular formula.
And I don't remember you saying, do you use a digital scale when you're doing the ratios, or is it just by volume when you're looking at the vessel that you're tincturing in?
If you're going to do a folk tincture, that's where you just put herb in a jar and pour your alcohol over it to fill up your jar. Whatever your ratio is on that, you don't really go by a ratio. But yes, you can use a digital scale. If you're going to be a little more precise, I would go by grams instead of ounces, or milliliters instead of ounces, because you are talking about weight and fluid. So if you're taking 1 ounce of leaf of dried herb and you need 5 fluid ounces of your alcohol, you'll get a little bit more accuracy if you go milliliters and milligrams for the weight. So either way, with the digital scale, most digital scales will do both methods, metric and ounce by weight and volume. So yeah, I would use scale.
Also, what are, for people who, for one of various reasons, religious beliefs, what are some alcohol-free options for making, herbal remedies at home, such as apple cider vinegar, olive oil, and how do those change the medicinal qualities of your extract?
Good question. If you look back through time, through history, say the last 200 years, Tommy Bass, for example, born at the turn of the 1900s, they never used alcohol. Alcohol was for the physician. So if you were looking for a remedy for something and for poor people, it had to work. So you had to know what to use. And that was by repetition. This works better than this herb. But yeah, you had to know what worked. And the only method they had was a tea, an infusion, an oxymel. They didn't call them oxymels that much, but you would take vinegar. Vinegar will extract minerals very well. It won't extract everything that alcohol will. However, there are other things that it does extract. And I will often make a multi-based formula of something. I'll use a cold water infusion, a hot water infusion. I'll infuse in vinegar, and then I'll also infuse in alcohol, depending on the herb. Now, that's not necessary for everything. That's getting a little bit technical, but you can do each one of those individually. You can take a powdered herb and powder it really fine and put that in honey. And then you could do the vinegar as well. I'll put vinegar in a lot of syrups. And one thing you have to remember, sometimes with certain people trying to get them to take it, children, elderly who just don't want to eat, is compliance. If they're not going to take it, it's not going to do any good. Just having that herb in a bottle is a problem for some people. Yeah, I bought this, or I'm taking half this, but I took it once. Usually once it's not gonna give you an effect that you're looking for. So making something that tastes a little bit better, like the powdered herb in honey, that's a very good way to give it to children, or to make a syrup. So you'll make a tea and then use that tea as a simple syrup. And that's very effective, depending on the herb. So vinegars.
I did. I used your mullein syrup recipe for my boys, but I think I got it too thick. It turned in, yeah, maybe I added too much sugar, but I put it in the fridge and it got really thick, almost like honey does when it, when you need to warm it up to make it liquid again.
Yeah.
So I don't know what I did, but
you can follow a simple syrup recipe. And some of my herbal friends laugh at me the way I say syrup, however you say syrup, it's that big sweet liquid. You can make it thin if you're going to use, say, 2 cups of liquid and 2 cups of sugar. That's equal amounts. So that's a 1-to-1 syrup, and that's going to give you a thicker syrup if you let it boil for a few minutes. But if you use 2 cups of your tea and only 1 cup of sugar, that's going to make a much thinner, almost just like tea, basically, but it's very sweet. I'll do a lot of mine that way, like a chaga syrup. I hardly ever make it thick. It's just a little bit more than tea with a really, really sweet tea. Because I pour it into my coffee and I want more of the chaga goodness in that tea. And because I want to use less sugar, most of my syrups are fairly thin. Still take it by a tablespoon. The consistency, it'll still be potent, but the consistency will be thinner. It doesn't have to be thick like pancake syrup to be effective. And you do that a lot. Syrups are mainly for the taste because herbs will often not taste good. Certain ones do. Flowers taste good, berries and things like that taste good, but there are bitter components to a lot of barks, some leaves, roots, things like that. So just depending on your herb, the thinner syrup will work just fine. Lemon balm makes a great syrup to pour into tea. So if you're needing that calming effect of lemon balm, make a thin tea. You can keep it in your fridge and you can pour it into a regular tea to help sweeten your tea, especially for children. Or use lollipops, if you're trying to get some of that goodness, the congestion or the respiratory formula, you can sweeten it. You put several of your herbs together into a tea, sweeten it, and make it into a popsicle or a cold pop for kids to suck on, and they'll get it. Even if it doesn't taste great, put something in there, maybe some fruit juice or something like that, as a base to make your lollipops, and then that'll help cool their system. They'll actually get it in, and then elderly people as well. Elderly and frail and children, you have to be careful on things like fever. So you don't want to give them hot teas that are going to be a diaphoretic, which means it'll make you sweat. It's hard to control their body temperature. So that's just a little side note to be aware of certain herbs, not to get it hot. But however, on that same point, certain herbs taken hot will be a decongestant, where it'll help the body sweat and break the fever when that's needed. So that's just something that you have to know by the herb. As you study individual herbs, you can find that out. Take this one hot, take this one cold, don't take this one hot. You'll learn that information as you go.
So overwhelming sometimes to me. I feel like you just, as soon as I learn something new, something else falls out of my head. It's hard to remember all that, but I mean, that's good to have resources like you, with your book. I reference your wild herb gardening book often, and I love all the pictures in it. So what were we going to, did you have anything else you wanted to talk to on the topic, as far as, I feel like we have a good base for, ratios of tinctures, the reasoning for the ratios. And I feel like that's a good foundation for someone that's starting to get into making tinctures. What do you think?
I think a good base, get a good book. My book is available, of course, on my website, Herbal Homestead Living. It's not the only So not the only book out there. Rosemary Gladstar has several books for beginners. One thing that I always encourage people, don't feel like you have to learn every single thing at once. Develop good notes. I have some information on, I have an herbal batch download. I also have a Materia Medica download on my website that goes into detail about things that you need to learn about certain herbs, the constituents in them, the actions that they perform on the body. These are things that you learn over time. Why do you use mullein? For congestion, for example, that's a big one nowadays. Everybody's getting into mullein, and I think that's great. But I do think people need to take a little bit of time and learn a little bit about it. So don't feel like, as a new herbalist, you have to know everything the first day. Just like you said yourself, you learn new things. When you learn something new, go back and put it in that chapter in your Materia Medica. I learn things all the time too, and I'm amazed. I just did a motherwort in my Granny Mentor program, and that's on my website as well. But I learned several different things about motherwort that I had not heard before, and why didn't I know this? And I've been doing this for 20 years. So don't feel like you learn everything. We had mentors. Tommy Bass, the last Appalachian doctor, had mentors that he worked with, and then he began to mentor people after years. So we're missing that now by watching a video or reading a book with nobody to discuss it with. And then you go into groups. Groups are wonderful, but you get a lot of false information or misleading information, or even worse, incomplete information. So be aware of that. Find a mentor. My Granny Mentor program just started last month, and it's available. I can give you a link to that if anyone is interested. It's a weekly 1-hour live class. Those recordings will be available, as well as the notes for the class. Monthly fee, and you get 4 classes per month. And you get to we talk about a specific herb per week. And that's the way I suggest to people is learn what you can learn about one herb, go into another herb, and then when you learn something about the first herb, put that in your Materia Medica and keep that note till you learn it. So you learn a lot of stuff that way. And it's a continual process for everybody.
I think that's a great deal for someone trying to get into herbalism, is your Granny Mentor program. I love that name, by the way. And so y'all can follow Suzanne on Facebook and Instagram, and also subscribe on her website, which is simplehomesteadliving.com. You can also find more info about her workshop with the Granny Mentor program on her website. She has the one book we mentioned, Wild Herb Gardening, but her newest book is Wild Things from Beyond the Garden Gate. And that's also on our website and Amazon. I'll link that in the show notes for y'all. And can you also briefly mention your upcoming speaking engagements in case anyone would like to hear from you in person?
Yes, that would be great. We have Harvest of Blessings coming up in September. That date is September 21st, 22nd. That's Saturday and Sunday. That's in Henryville, Indiana. It's a little small show. Wonderful speakers. Everyone is so friendly and so knowledgeable. We also have a Deep South conference coming up in Alabama. That's in Mentone, Alabama, November 4th and 5th. And then in July, I will be at the East Tennessee Homestead Alliance. I'll be speaking there. And that's a great Homestead conference, and there's quite a few herbalists, wild foods experts going to be there at that show, and that is the 12th, I believe, July 12th. And then I do various shows in the fall. If you're into bushcraft, I do Georgia Bushcrafters. So it's a great show, a lot of fun. It's if you want to learn to whittle and look for herbs in the wild and start a fire, things like that. It's a great show, especially for kids, or if you just want a few wild survival skills. It's a great show. I'll be at that one as well, and that is in October. I don't have the date of that one in front of me, but GeorgiaBushcraft.com is I believe how you find that one.
Great. Like you're going to have a busy time ahead of you.
I total about 20 shows a year. So I do have a calendar on my website, and I would love to meet you. If you see me speak somewhere, please come up and talk to me after, because I love to connect with people and give you encouragement if I can. I feel like this is a God talent and a God blessing that I've had this, and I've had wonderful mentors. And if I can be a mentor to someone else, I really want to do that.
So we are going to have Suzanne, we're going to have you back for foraging podcast, as well as the top 5 herbs to grow to use for medicine or remedy. However, I don't really care how the FDA says we need to say it. I'm just going to say it's basically herbal medicine. But thank you so much, Suzanne, for joining us on the Farmstead Farm podcast. We appreciate your wealth of knowledge and experience, and we're grateful for the time that you've taken to teach us these herbal medicinal truths. Your insights have been invaluable to our listeners, and we look forward to having you back in the future to share more about herbal medicine. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks for listening. Join our Facebook group and follow us on Instagram for the latest updates. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and visit our website for upcoming events. For sponsorship opportunities, reach out to us through our website. See you next time.